Breaking news. At 8:00 p.m., on the night before Easter Sunday, the sky over the Sea of Abaco didn't just turn dark, it turned into a crime scene. While the world prepared for a morning of peace, a single brilliant red flare cut through the Bahamian salt air. It was a scream for help, a signal of distress, and according to every maritime law on the planet, it should have brought every boat in the vicinity racing toward the yacht known as Soulmate. But here is the problem. Brian Hooker says he wasn't on that boat. By 8:00 p.m., Brian claims he was already miles away, a helpless victim of a monstrous storm, drifting aimlessly in a tiny 8-foot dinghy after his wife, Lynette, supposedly bounced off the back and vanished into the waves. He paints a picture of a broken man lost at sea, fighting for his life with a single oar. Yet multiple witnesses, people with no reason to lie, all saw the exact same thing. That flare didn't come from a drifting dinghy. It launched directly from the deck of the Soulmate. If Brian was drifting toward Marsh Harbor, who was standing on his yacht, pulling the trigger? This isn't just a story about a missing woman, it's a masterclass in the anatomy of a lie. Brian Hooker isn't just some guy who likes boats. He is a former United States Marine. He is a man trained to survive, trained to navigate, and trained to keep his head when everything goes sideways. But the story he's telling the Coast Guard, and the story he wants you to believe, defies every law of physics and every shred of military logic. He tells us the waves were 4 feet high, a howling Andrea Gale-style storm that ripped his wife away from him. But the weather stations don't lie. The security cameras at Lubber's quarters don't lie. The water that night wasn't a nightmare. It was a swimming pool. The wind wasn't pushing him toward Marsh Harbor. It was blowing straight toward the shore he claims he couldn't reach. Think about the bounce. Brian says Lynette fell out of the dinghy, and in that split second she took everything. She had the keys. She had the dry bag. She had the power. He was left rudderless. It's a convenient narrative for a man who wants to explain why he didn't call for help for 8 hours. But as any sailor will tell you, a dinghy doesn't just lose sight of a person in a calm sea unless someone is making sure they aren't found. We are looking at a 15-minute gap that changes everything. If they left the Abaco Inn at 7:30 p.m., they would have reached the Soulmate by 7:45. At 7:47, security footage catches a massive flash of light on the boat, a motion-triggered security floodlight. This suggests someone didn't bounce off a dinghy. Someone reached the yacht. Someone stepped onto that deck. And then 13 minutes later, the flare. A flare isn't just light, it's fire. It's sunshine in a bottle launched into the atmosphere. It stays lit for 10 seconds, burning a hole in the darkness so the whole world can see where you are. Brian says he fired one from a reef miles away where he was marooned in 2 feet of water. But the people on Elbow Key didn't look miles away. They looked at the Soulmate. Why fire a flare from your own boat if your wife fell out of a dinghy miles back? Unless the flare wasn't a signal for help? Unless the flare was a weapon or a distraction or the final exclamation point on an argument that went catastrophically wrong? Lynette Hooker didn't just vanish into the ocean. People don't just bounce out of existence. Every piece of tech Brian used to master, from the GPS systems he allegedly rigged at his old job to the high-tech security lights on his boat, is now starting to point back at him. The Marine thought he could outmaneuver the truth, but in the Sea of Abaco, the water is crystal clear, and the shadows he left behind are starting to take a very specific shape. To understand the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, you have to understand the wind. In the Bahamas, the wind is the ultimate witness. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't lie. Brian Hooker, a man with United States Marine training, knows exactly how weather affects a vessel. That is why his description of that night is so calculated, and why it is so impossible. Brian describes a nightmare. He tells investigators that as he and Lynette left the Abaco Inn in their small dinghy, they were slammed by 2 to 4 foot waves. He claims the wind was howling, a chaotic force that pushed him away from his wife the moment she allegedly fell overboard. He wants us to picture a scene from a disaster movie: dark, violent water and a desperate husband fighting a losing battle against the elements. But let's look at the science. Security footage and marine weather logs from that exact evening tell a completely different story. The Sea of Abaco that night was calm. The Andrea Gale storm Brian describes simply didn't exist. We have video of other boats in the area. Their masts aren't swaying, the water isn't churning, and the palm trees on shore aren't bending. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of night where you can hear a conversation from 100 yards away across the water. In a calm sea, if a person falls out of a slow-moving dinghy, they don't just disappear. You turn the boat around. You reach out a hand. You certainly don't get pushed miles away by a wind that isn't blowing. Then there's the direction of the wind. Brian claims he was blown 4 miles across the sea toward Marsh Harbor because he lost his oar and had no power. He says he was a passenger to the wind. But the wind that night was coming from the southwest. If you are in a floating bathtub with no motor and no oars and the wind is coming from the southwest, you don't clear the north end of Lubber's Quarters and drift to Marsh Harbor. If the wind was doing what the sensors say it was doing, Brian would have been pushed directly onto the shore of Lubber's Quarters, right toward Dean Zamziel's house. He would have hit land within minutes. He wouldn't have been lost at sea for 8 hours. He would have been standing on a neighbor's porch, bone dry, asking to use a phone. So why the 8-hour gap? Why show up at 4 a.m., 4 miles away? A Marine is trained in dead reckoning. They understand current, drift, and time. If Brian ended up in Marsh Harbor, it wasn't because the wind took him there, it's because he took himself there. When you look at the map, the journey he took requires intent. It requires navigating around reefs and land masses that a drifting boat would have naturally crashed into. The broken oar is another convenient piece of the puzzle. He claims the pin broke and the oar vanished. In a 2-foot-deep reef area, things don't just vanish forever. Yet that oar, the only piece of evidence that would prove his struggle, has never been found. When you strip away the howling wind and the crashing waves, what you're left with is a man in a functional boat on a calm night, moving away from the spot where his wife was last seen. He wasn't fighting a storm. He was using the cover of a quiet night to create a distance that physics says he couldn't have traveled by accident. Lynette didn't stand a chance against a storm that wasn't there. She was up against something far more dangerous, a tactical mind that was already rewriting the weather before the sun even came up. As the clock ticked past midnight on that Easter Sunday, the Sea of Abaco should have been a graveyard of silence. According to Brian Hooker's official story, he was currently 4 hours into a desperate, lonely drift across the open water, miles away from his yacht, Soulmate. The boat should have been a ghost ship, empty, dark, and swaying silently on its anchor in Aunt Pat's Bay. But the cameras tell a story that Brian didn't plan for. At 12:27 a.m., a mile away from the nearest witness, a shadow moved. Thanks to the meticulous work of Dean Zamziel and his daughters, we have a digital eye on the exact spot where the Soulmate was moored. And in the dead of night, something triggered the yacht's security system. Suddenly, a flashlight cuts through the darkness. It's not a steady beacon. It's swinging, searching, sweeping across the deck of the Soulmate. And then the yacht itself erupts in light. The high-powered stern spotlights, the ones Brian, the tech geek, likely rigged himself, flicker to life. Who was there? If Brian is 4 miles away, clinging to his bathtub dinghy in a phantom storm, then who is walking the deck of his boat at midnight? This isn't a random occurrence. We see the flashlight beam fire directly toward the camera at Lubber's Quarters. Then the deck lights stay lit, illuminating the transom. A few moments later, the deck lights are manually shut off, but the smaller light, the kind you'd see on a dinghy, remains active. It looks like a boarding. It looks like a return. But it doesn't stop there. 5 minutes later, at 12:32 a.m., it happens again. 5 distinct flashes of a handheld light, followed by the massive security floodlight firing for exactly 53 seconds. In the world of professional security, you can tailor those timers. You can set them to stay on long enough to get below deck, or long enough to move something heavy. This wasn't a glitch. This was a sequence. Brian's former colleagues at AT&T described him as a man who knew how to manipulate technology. He was a guy who could jury-rig a GPS to hide his location. He was a guy who claimed he didn't know how to use WhatsApp while simultaneously managing complex electrical systems on a 46-foot sailboat. So let's look at the tech-savvy Marine theory. If you wanted to create an alibi, you'd need to be seen miles away. But if you needed to return to the scene of the crime to finish a job, to scrub a deck, to retrieve a bag, or to move a body, you'd do exactly what we see on this tape. You'd move fast, you'd use your knowledge of the boat systems to navigate the dark, and you'd pray that the grainy camera a mile away wouldn't catch the flicker of your flashlight. The light events at 12:27 and 12:32 are the smoking guns of the midnight hour. They prove that the Soulmate wasn't abandoned. Someone was active. Someone was working. And while Brian was preparing to wash up in Marsh Harbor at 4 a.m., with a story of tragedy, the cameras in Aunt Pat's Bay were recording the evidence of a man who was never really lost at all. He wasn't drifting, he was busy. And the light he used to see his way through the dark is the very thing that is finally bringing the truth into the sun. To understand why the lights were flashing on the Soulmate at midnight, you have to understand the man who held the switch. Behind the tragic husband facade Brian Hooker presented to the Bahamian authorities lies a paper trail of violence so chilling it makes his story of a boating accident feel like a cruel joke. In investigative journalism, we look for patterns, and Brian Hooker's pattern is one of hands, specifically hands around necks. This isn't speculation. This is documented in the cold, hard ink of court papers. Brian was once put on trial for allegedly choking his own 12-year-old daughter. Think about that. While he was eventually acquitted, the testimony stayed on the record. Witnesses stood under oath and described a man who didn't just lose his temper, he became handsy, physical, and dominant. Lynette Hooker knew this side of him better than anyone. She didn't just live with the fear, she documented it. She took photos of her own body, bruises blooming across her back, marks that told the story of being pinned down, being choked out, being reminded who was in control. She sent these photos to her friends, not as a cry for help, but as a reminder to herself. She knew she had a habit of going back to him, and she needed the visual evidence of her own pain to try and stay away. But she always went back. And on that final trip to the Bahamas, she was trapped in 46 feet of fiberglass with a man who had a history of making things go sideways after a few drinks. On the night she disappeared, they'd been drinking. Not heavily, perhaps, but enough to lower the threshold of a man with a hair-triggered temper. Brian's colleagues at AT&T didn't just know him as a tech-savvy guy. They knew him as a man who played by his own rules, a union steward who was eventually let go for manipulating his GPS to vanish from the company's radar. He was a man who knew how to disappear while being right in front of you. Now look back at the flare event at 8 p.m. If Brian and Lynette got back to the boat at 7:47 and things went sideways between this volatile couple, that flare gun becomes something much more sinister than a distress signal. In a tiny, cramped cabin, the size of a small trailer, there is nowhere to run. A flare gun in a confined space isn't a tool, it's a weapon. Was the flare fired at her? Was it a signal to someone else? Or was it the opening act of a cover-up by a man who realized that this time he'd gone too far? When the Coast Guard met Brian on the docks, they brought a cadaver dog. They didn't do that because they believed his story about a bouncing wife. They did it because they know that men who choke their daughters and bruise their wives don't usually have accidents at sea. They have episodes. Lynette's friends are now left staring at those old photos of her bruised back, wondering if the episode that happened on the Soulmate was the one she wouldn't be able to walk away from. The Marine knew how to survive crawl through a swamp, but Lynette was just a woman who loved a man who treated her body like a training ground for his rage. If you wanted to make a person disappear in the Abaco, you wouldn't leave them in the open sea. The Sea of Abaco is a giant, crystal-clear swimming pool. The authorities flew grid patterns, used sonar, and deployed drones. They searched every inch of that water. Lynette wasn't there. She wasn't on the shorelines. She wasn't on the reefs. So where is she? Let's look at this through the eyes of a United States Marine. A man like Brian Hooker doesn't panic, he calculates. He knows that the sea is too public, but the mangroves? The mangroves are a tomb. Just 2.9 nautical miles from where the Soulmate was anchored, a distance easily covered in a fast dinghy, lies a labyrinth of swampy, yucky waterways tucked underneath the Hopetown Lighthouse. This is an area that tourists avoid and locals have no reason to visit. It is a world of thick, tangled roots that reach down into the mud like fingers. In tactical training, you learn how to use the environment to mask your movements. A mangrove swamp is the perfect tactical hide. The water is murky, the tide is predictable, and the smell, the thick, sulfurous stench of decaying organic matter, is powerful enough to mask the scent of anything else. If a guy needed to hide a body, he wouldn't just throw it overboard. He would tuck it deep into those roots. In these swamps, you can wedge something into the root system so securely that it won't float away with the tide, even without using weights. You don't need to leave behind chains or anchors that could be traced back to your boat. You just need a dinghy, the cover of darkness, and a cold enough heart to push through the muck. Think about the timeline again. We saw those light events at 12:27 and 12:32 a.m. If Brian returned to the boat then, he had 4 hours before he washed up in Marsh Harbor at 4 a.m. 4 hours is more than enough time for a trained Marine to navigate a dinghy 2.8 miles into the mangroves, finish a grim task, and then set his boat on a course to discover himself marooned miles away. The route is easy. You slip out of Aunt Pat's Bay, hug the shoreline where the shadows are deepest, and disappear into the mangroves. There are no cameras there. There are no witnesses. Only the roots and the silence. Brian Hooker keeps telling people to find his wife, but he hasn't lifted a finger to help. Maybe that's because he knows exactly where she is. He knows she isn't drifting in the current. He knows she isn't waiting to be found by a sonar sweep. The Marine isn't worried about the open ocean. He's counting on the fact that nobody wants to go into the stinking, rotting heart of the mangroves. But that is exactly where the secrets are buried. Brian Hooker's military training taught him how to survive in the wild, but it didn't teach him how to outrun a community that refuses to forget Lynette. He is banking on your silence. He is banking on the hope that we will all just move on to the next headline. But we aren't moving on. We are watching the lights on the Soulmate. We are watching the wind patterns. And we are waiting for the moment the truth finally surfaces. Because in this case, the truth isn't just serious. It's drop-dead serious. Lynette deserves more than a story about a bounce. She deserves justice. And we won't stop until she gets it.